The dreaded TSA pat down is something that everyone, or I should say most people, want to avoid at all costs. But what exactly does it entail? In this video, I'm going to break down everything you need to know about TSA pat downs. We're going to talk about the different reasons why you might get a pat down and also explain what exactly the experience will be like. Hey, it's Daniel Gillespie, founder of UponArriving.com and travel blogger since 2014. If you like practical travel tips and reviews, be sure to subscribe and hit that little bell icon so that you don't miss out on anything. So TSA pat-downs have not always been done the same way. Back in 2015, a report came out of an internal investigation where undercover investigators were able to smuggle mock explosives and banned weapons through checkpoints in 95% of trials. So that 95% failure rate wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement of TSA's effectiveness, so naturally it led to some changes when it comes to pat-downs. So in the past, a TSA agent could perform a pat-down in one of 5 different ways, but after that report came out, the policies changed and TSA adopted a standard pat-down policy that still has a couple of different variations to it, but for the most part, everyone's getting the same type of pat-down. So first, let's talk about why you might get a TSA pat-down in the first place. And if there is one silver lining about these pat-downs, it's that they are pretty predictable. So one of the most common reasons why you'll get a pat-down is if you refuse to go through the walk-through metal detector or the full body scanner. For some people, going through these is not an option for certain medical or health reasons, and others just consider it like a form of protest to not go through them. But bottom line, if you refuse to go through those, you are guaranteed to get a pat-down. Another reason why you might get a pat-down is if the scanners detect a foreign object that can't be resolved. So I once went through a full body scanner and I had this tiny little Advil pill in my left pocket. And after I went through the scanner, an agent came up to me and asked me if I had something in my left pocket. And I was just completely like dumbfounded. I reached in there and found this little tiny pill, and they had me go back through the full body scanner one more time and nothing set off. And then they just let me go on my way. So sometimes you can just get through if something is detected with no pat down. Other times they may want to pat you down, and that is especially the case if they can't resolve whatever the anomaly is that was setting off the alarm. So that's often the case with people that have certain types of medical implants, and we're actually going to talk a lot about medical issues and pat downs at the end of this video, so be sure to stick around for that. The next reason why you might get a pat down is if you're traveling with a questionable item. So let's say you had some oversized liquids in the form of like baby formula and it can't be tested. We're actually going to talk about a case related to that in a minute, but that's one reason why. Other times, maybe you're traveling with a lot of powder. So anything that's in that gray area that could trigger an agent to want to put you through a pat down. Also, if you get hit with the quad, which is whenever you have those 4 capital letter S's on your boarding pass, that means that you're going to have to go through an enhanced screening, and that often requires a pat down in addition to other screening methods like swabbing. So sometimes you can get hit with the quad on a random basis, but other times it's your travel habits that can trigger getting that on your boarding pass. And I'm going to make a video going into that in detail later on, but just know that if you see those letters on your boarding pass, there is a very high chance that a pat down is right around the corner. Next, you can also get a pat down referral from a behavior detection officer, also known as a BDO. So a lot of people don't even know about these people. These are officers in TSA who are trained to look for certain behaviors that could indicate that a passenger is essentially up to something. So thanks to a document leaking back in 2015, we actually have an idea of what they consider to be suspicious behavior. And some of these behavior patterns are legit suspicious, like finding someone who appears to be traveling in a disguise. That's understandable that you would want to put them through a pat down, but a lot of these behaviors could apply to just about anyone. So they would consider things like exaggerated yawning or throat clearing or even whistling or gazing down. These are things that obviously can apply to a lot of people. So understandably, the efficacy and the scientific basis of these is highly in question, but it is worth knowing that if you display any of these so-called nervous behaviors, that could put you in line for a pat down. Another way to get a pat down is if you get a referral from a travel document checker. These are also known as TDCs. So these are the people that you hand over your boarding pass to, or you show your ID to whenever you're getting in line for security. They may notice something suspicious about your documents or just your appearance, similar to the officers we just talked about. And in that case, you could find yourself in that pat down line. And something to just remember is that if you do have TSA pre-check, that does not exclude you from potentially getting a pat down. Alrighty, so what happens during the TSA pat down experience? I'm going to talk about some of the rules and procedures. Basically, I went through like hundreds of pages from TSA training documents and found out a lot about the process. So there were a lot of redacted sections, which means that we don't know everything about the training process, but I think we know enough to give you a good sense of what to expect. So first, an agent's going to let you know that in order for you to get through security, you're going to have to submit to a pat down. So it's not that you're forced to undergo the pat down, but if you plan on traveling that day or getting through security, then you are essentially forced to go through it. At that point, you should be presented with the option of getting a pat down in an open area nearby the security checkpoint or in a private screening area. If you elect for the private screening area, then you can bring along one person who can act as a witness, or judging by some of the videos out there, just a friend who can basically laugh at you as you undergo your misfortune. Now, that witness or friend that you bring into the room with you should be able to film the pat down session in case you're worried about mistreatment back there, but you could potentially run into trouble when doing this. So TSA is very explicit that they do not prohibit you from taking photos or video at the checkpoints as long as you don't interfere with screening or obtaining sensitive information. And the problem with this is that interfering with screening can be a very vague concept, subject to interpretation. And there actually are instances of TSA agents demanding people to stop recording and even delete their videos. And unfortunately, this has even held up in court, including a recent case from the Fourth Circuit. In that case, there was a couple, he and his husband, along with their kids, were going through security, and apparently he had some type of baby formula on him that triggered the pat down screening. So the husband went into the back room with him to get the pat down and private screening, and his husband was standing about 10 feet away from him and was filming the pat down. And the agent basically said, hey, I'm going to need you to stop recording this. You're impeding with the process or interfering with the process. And the guy was like, well, no, I want to keep recording. So the TSA agent called a supervisor, who then came in, and the supervisor also told him not only to stop recording, but hey, I'm going to need you to go ahead and delete that video. And in fact, she even stood over his shoulder waiting for him to delete the video. Now, he later recovered it, I guess, just from his recycle bin, essentially. But they decided to go ahead and sue on the basis of getting infringed upon for their First Amendment and Fourth Amendment rights. Now, the district court initially ruled in their favor on a motion to dismiss, but eventually the Court of Appeals in the Fourth Circuit ruled in favor of TSA and essentially gave them immunity for the agents. So I honestly don't think this is constitutional, and I think it's a major area of concern, but it is worth knowing that while you should have the right to record these people doing the pat downs, it's possible that a TSA agent could tell you to stop recording and even delete your videos. And if you chose to sue them in court on the basis of infringing upon your rights, you will most likely lose based on the current law. So back to the screening process, if you opt for that private screening room, then your luggage should be brought into that room, but you're not going to be able to access the luggage until the pat down is complete. Now, if you go for the open area screening, then your luggage is just going to be sitting there by the conveyor belts, and maybe you can ask an agent if they can position you so that you can have your luggage in your view, just to make sure nobody is tampering with it or stealing anything. So a TSA agent of the same gender should be performing the pat down, and if you go the private screening route, then a second TSA agent of the same gender should also join in on the room as well. As far as what gender is used, it's going to be the gender based on what the passenger identifies as. So for transgender people, this is probably a relief. I don't think it's based on the sex or gender listed on your ID. I think it's what you sort of present yourself to be. According to the TSA training, it's possible that an agent of the same gender may not be available, and so TSA could attempt to pat down with an officer of the opposite gender, but there is a whole kind of protocol. I'm not going to get into all of that, but just know that if there is no personnel available, it's possible that they may try to bring someone in of the opposite gender. Now, if you want, you can request the TSA agent to wear a fresh pair of gloves. I think this was made mandatory during the coronavirus pandemic, but as everyone has become more relaxed towards the pandemic, I'm not sure if that policy is still in place, but just something you may want to think of if you want kind of an extra sanitary experience. As far as the standard pat down, it's going to hit on pretty much every area of your body, and before beginning, the agent should stand there and explain to you what the process is going to be like. And as they move from body part to body part, they also should sort of alert you of where their hands are going to be moving to next, so you're not caught off guard. If you have any medical issues or sensitive regions of your body, just let the agent know that, and they should be able to respond accordingly and maybe, use a little bit less pressure in some of those areas. An agent should only ask you to remove your outerwear. That would be something like your jackets, along with your belt and shoes, and any items inside your pockets should also be removed. So Other clothing should remain on. So there are some reports of TSA doing strip searches. So I don't know what's going on in these cases, because out of all the training materials I looked at, there's nothing that would even suggest that it's remotely acceptable for them to do this. And TSA is even on record stating that they do not conduct strip searches. So an agent could request for you to like hold up your shirt while they check your waistline, but as far as them requesting you to remove an article of clothing, that should be a huge red flag, and absolutely you'd want to involve a supervisor, because TSA, from everything I can tell, does not have the authority to do that. And some of the lawsuits I looked through looked a little bit iffy. I'm not saying this doesn't happen. I mean, TSA is a huge organization. There's always going to be bad apples and people that want to abuse their power. But I don't think that TSA officers trying to force strip searches is anything common. So now let's talk about the actual inspection. So when it begins, you're going to be asked to stand with your legs shoulder width apart and to raise up your arms. The agent should ask you if you can remain in that position for about 4 minutes. If you can't, then just tell them and they should provide you with a chair. So the pat down is going to start with your head. And if you have a lot of hair or some kind of like poofy or tall hairstyle, your hair could actually be subject to sort of its own pat down. And so there is talk about sort of discrimination for some women in this area. But if you have a lot of hair that just kind of looks like something could be hidden on the inside, there's a good chance that you'll have to go through that additional pat down for your hair. So just be prepared for that. After they pat down your head area, they're going to move on to your collars and your arms, including your underarms. And the whole time they're going to be applying, just a firm amount of pressure to detect anything that could be potentially hidden underneath your clothes. Then they're going to head down to your waistline, which is where the pat downs really start to get uncomfortable. So they're going to check around the inside of your waistband and the front and the back to make sure that nothing is hidden there. And then we get to the sensitive areas, and we don't know the exact policies for these because TSA did redact a lot of the commentary or instructions in the training manual, so I wasn't able to see anything there. But based on videos released by TSA, we know that agents are instructed to use the back of their hand for sensitive areas like the breast, the groin, and the butt. However, TSA did mention that sometimes they have to use the front of the hand, I guess, to detect certain objects. So as you would expect, the sensitive areas are going to be the most controversial aspect of the pat downs. And if you look at some of the videos online, the videos look really bad, but you have to consider that a pat down of sensitive areas is always going to look bad. You're never going to look at a video of someone getting a pat down in that area and think, oh yeah, that looks pretty pleasant. It's always going to look bad. And I have seen some sort of like uproar about videos that I've looked at, and then I compared to the videos released by TSA that essentially show their protocol, and a lot of times those officers are actually following the protocol. So take the issue out with TSA and not necessarily the officer doing the job, because at that point they're just doing their job. So with that said, there are definitely some videos out there I've seen where it looks like an agent is overdoing it, and it's typically that swiping motion that they do. It's kind of side to side, up and down, and it looks like sometimes they're just kind of hanging out in that sensitive region a little too long, and you're just sort of like, okay buddy, like how many swipes do you really need to get in there? And that's really where the problems really begin. So that would be the number one thing I would be kind of paying attention to, is it's not so much where they're touching, but how long that they're remaining there, and do they have any reason for being there for that long. So as far as how you deal with that uncomfortable feeling, I've seen a lot of people that just kind of have fun with it, or they're just sort of like laughing, and I think it's a way to kind of just relieve the tension and kind of deal with the embarrassment of the whole situation. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, just kind of like laughing it off. But I have seen some people take it a little bit too far. They're like essentially like twerking on the TSA agent, which I think is a little bit extreme if you ask me. But so I said, just deal with the awkwardness in whatever way you feel comfortable with, but just try not to go too far with it. And after you get done with those regions, they're going to be checking the inside of your thighs and your legs, which is still, a sensitive region. And if you have some type of like a skirt or dress or like a kilt or whatever on, they're going to ask you to do this process where you step one leg forward, and that's how they're going to do the pat down there. But once you get through with that, you're pretty much finished. Although if they find an item in your garments or on your person, they're going to need to run that either through the x-ray or give it a close physical inspection. It's also possible that an agent may want to do a swab of your hands or your clothing. This is usually just to detect for traces of explosives. And this typically only takes a couple of minutes if everything goes correctly. So this will be one of the shortest parts of the pat down. So after you get done with all of that, you can exit with your luggage. You can breathe a huge sigh of relief and just head out to your flight, which hopefully you're not going to miss because of the delay. And As far as the time that it takes for the pat down, that's really going to vary based on, I think a lot of it has to do with the available personnel. If they're struggling to bring people in, or if they have to match genders or find space, that can slow things down. But a lot of times you can be done with this in under 10 minutes if everything goes right. So how does the pat down process work for children? Obviously a very sensitive topic. Well, for kids 13 and older, it's just going to be the standard pat down policy we already described. So, teenagers are essentially subject to the same pat down policies as adults. But for children under 12, TSA states that the officers will consult parents or the traveling guardian about the best way to relieve any concerns during the screening of a child and to resolve any alarms during screening. So what does that mean? I have no idea. I guess it just means that they're going to try to actively work with the parent, but there are some rules that they have in place, like the child should never be involuntarily separated from the adults, and the adult can even hold the child's hand during the process. So the child should be pretty much tethered to the adult during this whole time. Also, there always must be an adult to witness the pat down. And so in the case of like an unaccompanied minor, this could be like an aircraft operator escort or, some personnel of the airline. And finally, TSA reportedly modified the screening process so that children 12 and under have reduced odds of getting a pat down. So again, I don't know how reduced those odds are, but it seems they're at least actively trying to avoid the situation. And finally, let's talk about pat downs and medical implants and devices. So if you have something like a hip or knee replacement or metal plate, screws or rods, or any kind of other type of orthopedic implant, then those could create an issue when going through security screening. And there are a few different ways that you can go about it. So for some people, for health reasons, maybe they don't want to go through the full body scanner or the metal detector. And so again, if you refuse those, then you're going to have to get a pat down. And at that point, you're just going to have to adjust to getting that pat down every time you go through security. In other cases, you may have one of the medical devices or implants I mentioned already, and there's a chance that you could set off a metal detector or the full body scanner. So, you got to remember that scanner can detect a lot of different things. And one of the things is like scar tissue. So if you had some kind of major surgery, like a hip or knee replacement, and your skin is kind of misshapen, that could be detected. And then you would have to step out and tell the officer, hey, I've had this procedure. What they're probably going to do is pull out the wand. So they have that metal detector wand, and then they're going to try to isolate where that metal is coming from and check all of your body. And following that could be a pat down as well, but there are ways that you can maybe reduce that from happening. So one thing that you can do is that you can fill out a TSA notification card, which is basically, it's like a PDF that you can just fill out and print out in the form of a card. And it just states that you have a medical condition. I think some doctors' offices also have cards that they will give their patients that are pretty similar to this. But even if you don't have that, you could just print out the TSA notification card and then combine that with a letter from your doctor explaining that you have some type of medical implant. And that will just give the TSA kind of a better idea of what's going on. And so you could avoid the pat down. Another thing you can do is contact the TSA Cares Assistance Program. So you want to do this about 72 hours prior to traveling. And this will put you in touch with a passenger support specialist, and they can maybe help you get through security or answer questions that you have, and that might also help you to reduce the odds of you getting a pat down. So that's all for TSA pat downs. I hope that this video helped you to understand how to avoid them and what to expect if you are subject to one. If you had any experiences with pat downs, good or bad, or I guess they would probably all be bad, but if you feel a certain way about them, be sure to let me know in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear your opinions.